Joseph Goebbels was one of the most controversial figures of the Third Reich. An expert in oratory according to his contemporaries of the time, the phrases he delivered through the microphone were said to have caused more damage to the enemy than the bombs during the Second World War. Paul Joseph Goebbels was born on the 29th of October 1897 in Reit, Rhineland, which at that time was part of the Second German Empire north of Westphalia. His father was an employee of a small industry named Friedrich Goebbels, and his mother was a humble woman descending from a Jewish family from Holland named Maria Katharina Odenhausen. Both parents were of fervent Catholic origin, and they decided to expand the family by having 4 other children in addition to Joseph, specifically his 2 brothers Hans and Conrad and 2 girls, Maria and Elizabeth, although the latter died from an illness at 4 years of age. Physically weak, with a large head, small eyes, and a haggard appearance, Goebbels fell ill with polio at 4 years of age, which required him to undergo surgery that at 10 years old left him partially lame in one leg. Because of the humiliation that illness caused him, Goebbels' childhood was sad and bitter, which is why he spent years locked in the basement of his home reading and cultivating himself with old books and encyclopedias. Goebbels felt very frustrated when the First World War broke out between 1914 and 1918, since due to his illness, he was not allowed to enlist in the Imperial German Army and therefore had to watch helplessly as Germany lost the conflict without being able to do anything. His parents, very worried about their son's future, decided he should pursue a career in the priesthood, something Goebbels initially agreed to by joining the Albertus Magnus Society and being trained in the vocation by Johannes Mollen. To study there, the Goebbels family requested a loan of 964 marks from the Albertus Magnus Society to be repaid long-term and without interest, which Johannes Mollen justified to its members by saying, "Herr Goebbels is the son of good Catholics, and his religion and morality make him worthy of all recommendation." Curiously, the money would not be repaid until 14 years later, after a lawsuit won by the Catholic Society when Goebbels was already Minister of Propaganda. However, Goebbels did not feel content with his studies as a priest, so he abandoned them to his parents' disappointment, preferring instead to pursue a university degree. At first, Goebbels enrolled at the University of Bonn, then at the University of Würzburg, later at the University of Freiburg, also at the University of Munich, and finally at the University of Heidelberg, where he was taught by the famous Jewish literary professor, Friedrich Gundolf. Goebbels responded very positively in his studies, achieving excellent grades in religion, German language, Latin, and Greek, although he was always forced to move from one rented room to another, depending on the city, and to stretch his limited money. His university life was happy, since despite his physical shortcomings and short stature of 1 meter and 60 centimeters, Goebbels had the character of a gentleman, with a captivating voice, intelligence, and culture, which made him admired among young women and even allowed him to have some romances with friends like Anke Stalin, or with one of his professors, named Elsa. It was during his student years that Goebbels discovered his talent as an orator and communicator, which quickly led him to develop an interest in writing and theater. Finally, at 23 years of age, Goebbels earned his doctorate in philosophy. After finishing his degree, Goebbels returned to his parents' home in Reit to work as a private tutor and as secretary to a conservative deputy named Franz von Wiegenshaus. Later he obtained a job in a subsidiary of the Dresdner Bank in Cologne, and afterward as a trader of industrial securities on the stock exchange. Nevertheless, what truly interested Goebbels was everything related to oratory and words, so very soon he began writing articles and plays that he sent to newspapers and publishers, which unfortunately were always rejected. Despite everything, Goebbels did not give up and tried his luck offering his services as a stage director, but he was not accepted either. His last attempts included trying to work as an editor for the Berliner Tageblatt magazine and writing a novel titled Michael for the Ullstein Publishing House, although both projects failed. Because of these disappointments, Goebbels began to take an interest in politics when, by chance, some pamphlets of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, came into his hands, which he read with interest and later discussed with his friends. In early January of 1924, Goebbels accompanied his friend Fritz Prang to a political debate in which the socialists were on one side and the National Socialists on the other. At one point during the meeting, Goebbels was invited to step onto the platform and speak. With a captivating voice, he began by saying, "My dear German compatriots." That phrase provoked boos from the socialists, who insulted him, shouting, "Capitalist exploiter." Then Goebbels, pointing to the seats with his finger, said, "That gentleman over there who calls me a capitalist, let him come, please, and show, as I am doing, The money he has in his pocket. Let's see who has more. Suddenly, Goebbels emptied his almost empty wallet onto the table, which provoked applause from the whole hall in his favor. After this experience, Goebbels, through the National Socialist leader in Rhineland, Karl Kaufmann, joined the NSDAP with membership number 8762. Initially, Goebbels began working on the economic matters of the NSDAP as soon as he joined the party, a task he carried out successfully while the organization was experiencing financial difficulties. He met Adolf Hitler in 1924, shortly after Hitler was released from prison following the failed Munich Putsch. The two were impressed with each other, as both were expert orators. Hitler, in fact, saw in Goebbels a key instrument to win his political battle. So in 1926, he entrusted him with a mission no one else wanted: to be sent to Berlin, the most difficult stronghold for a National Socialist, since the city by far provided the fewest votes for the NSDAP, in favor of conservative monarchist or left-wing parties. As leader of the Berlin NSDAP, Goebbels faced the challenging mission of bringing order and discipline among the party's followers in the capital. Immediately after getting off the train that had dropped him at the Potsdamer Bahnhof station, Goebbels had to drag all his luggage by himself, carrying the book Mein Kampf under his arm, before heading directly to the NSDAP headquarters to give new orders to the members. He first sought to improve the party's finances by requiring 600 of the 1,000 affiliates to pay a monthly fee of 3 marks, in addition to selling tickets for admission to each of its rallies. He also reorganized the brown shirt militias of the SA under the leadership of Kurt Delouage to make them more effective in the streets, and he launched a local newspaper called Der Angriff, the Attack. He even replaced the old posters with new, much larger ones in blazing red or bright colors, with huge slogans that read, "Lenin or Hitler," or "The Kaiser of America speaks in Berlin." Such measures were intended to ensure that the media and the people of Berlin would talk about the party, even if negatively, something Goebbels emphasized with these words: "The Berliners must insult us, slander us, fight us, thrash us, but they must talk about us." Some of Goebbels' most famous slogans during his time as leader of the NSDAP in Berlin were the following: "In propaganda, as in love, everything is permitted. Propaganda is like art. It does not need to respect the truth. A lie repeated 1,000 times becomes reality. And Hitler is Germany as Germany is Hitler." All of Goebbels' speeches became spectacles that no one wanted to miss. His oratory possessed an incredible magnetism and energy that mobilized the masses. Each time he had to speak, the first thing he would say to his colleagues was, "Which record shall we play today?" In fact, the shouts of that genius of the microphone were accompanied by marches, parades, flags, songs, and choirs. He was never punctual for his talks, because he knew that by arriving a few minutes late, the tension among the audience would increase. Curiously, one day he arrived at a rally by taxi, something his colleague Otto Strasser reproached him for as a useless expense, to which Goebbels replied, "You have not the slightest idea of what propaganda is. I should have arrived in 2 taxis, one for myself and another for my travel bag." Because of his fiery character, many rallies ended in violent disturbances against communists who burst in to sabotage the National Socialists, confrontations in which sometimes there were injured people on both sides. In fact, Goebbels knew how to turn the injured on his side into martyrs in the eyes of public opinion, as happened with his driver Albert Thonack, who, after being struck on the head with a bottle, was brought onto the stage on a stretcher. He showered even more honors on Horst Wessel, a Berliner who was killed at the hands of the communists, whom he transformed into a hero by naming the NSDAP anthem after him, the Horst Wessel Lied. However, because of these tragic incidents, on some occasions the police forced the suspension of NSDAP meetings for reasons of public order, so Goebbels quickly modified the objective of the rally, turning it into a sporting or tourist event that would still end up being held. When in the elections of 1930 the NSDAP won 107 seats in the Reichstag, Goebbels was elected deputy. With his new position, he intensified propaganda more than ever through more effective means. Among the advertising tactics he employed were the broadcasting of his speeches over the radio, the 50,000 gramophone records he distributed throughout Germany, and the films he projected in theaters, sports halls, public gardens, cafes, and restaurants. He even went so far as to hire airplanes to drop leaflets with the phrase, "The Führer arrives from the sky." Magda Quandt was the great love of Goebbels and the woman he would eventually marry. Initially married to Günther Quandt, an industrialist from whom she divorced due to their age difference, she soon met Goebbels while working as a secretary in the NSDAP archives. Surprisingly, the attraction between them was instantaneous, and they married on the 12th of December 1931, with Hitler acting as best man at their wedding. From the marriage, 6 children were born: Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, and Haida, all beginning with the letter H in honor of Hitler. Goebbels also became the stepfather of Harold, a 10-year-old boy from Magda's previous marriage, who would later become a pilot in the German Air Force, Luftwaffe. So aggressive were Goebbels' speeches in the Reichstag that in February of 1932, he was expelled from parliament as a deputy for insulting President Paul von Hindenburg. At that moment, Goebbels was on the verge of becoming a political corpse, since in April he was accused by the Reichstag of high treason, and in July he was stoned by a crowd in his hometown, Reit, from which he emerged unharmed. But his luck changed in January of 1933, when the NSDAP came to power and Hitler became Führer of the Third Reich, restoring Goebbels to his former prestige. On the 13th of March 1933, Joseph Goebbels was appointed Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, while at the same time becoming Governor, Gauleiter, of Berlin, 2 posts he would hold for the rest of his life. Up to that date, all his experience in the conquest of power had been recorded in 2 memoirs he himself wrote, titled The Battle for Berlin, Kampf um Berlin, and From the Kaiserhof to the Reich Chancellery, Vom Kaiserhof zur Reichskanzlei. One of Goebbels' first measures as Minister of Propaganda was to help consolidate Hitler's position in power by collaborating and fabricating a lie to blame the communists for the Reichstag fire. Thanks to this stratagem, which turned out to be a complete success, the National Socialists managed to have President von Hindenburg decree the banning of political parties, trade unions, and associations. The following year, in 1934, Goebbels also took charge of inventing an alleged betrayal by the SA in order to purge that militia in favor of the SS, including its leader Ernst Röhm in the so-called Night of the Long Knives. During his time as Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, Goebbels set himself the goal of completely taking over German culture. He quickly gained control of the press, radio, and all means of communication, but his greatest weapon was taking over the film industry through the UFA studios to produce films that exalted pan-German values and the virtues of National Socialism. One of his most notable achievements was hiring film director Leni Riefenstahl to create the documentaries Olympia and Triumph of the Will, which were internationally acclaimed on the occasion of the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936. Abroad, Goebbels became world famous through the Transoceanic Press Agency, a political instrument that built an extensive network of journalists spread across many countries. To London alone, he sent 83 experts, who edited 300 National Socialist newspapers or contributed articles to another 350 publications. At the same time that Goebbels promoted National Socialist culture, he also worked to neutralize that of the opposition. His first victim was the expropriation of the Ullstein Publishing House, precisely the same publisher that had rejected one of his works after university. He quickly drew up a blacklist against other newspapers, magazines, and publishers considered unpatriotic, in addition to persecuting books and publications by writers suspected of being communists, Freemasons, or Jews, such as Karl Marx, Stefan Zweig, Erich Maria Remarque, Thomas Mann, Erich Kästner, Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, and others, whose works were thrown into great public bonfires. So ingenious was his propaganda against the enemy that he even organized an exhibition of degenerate art to ridicule works such as those of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Vincent van Gogh, or Paul Gauguin. Outside of political life, Goebbels' wealth grew enormously thanks to his ministerial salary and the 4,000 Reichsmarks he was paid by the newspaper Das Reich for each of his articles, as well as the royalties from his new book titled Bolshevism in Theory and Practice, Der Bolschewismus in Theorie und Praxis. With so much income, Goebbels became the owner of 2 estates in Schwanenwerder, another in Wannsee, another in Lanka, and a final one in Bodensee, in addition to owning an armored Mercedes car with 8mm thick bulletproof plating, a gift from Hitler. Something else Goebbels never lacked was lovers, usually secretaries, young NSDAP members, or actresses. For example, in 1938, his wife Magda was on the verge of divorcing him when she discovered the affair he was having with the Czechoslovak actress Lida Barova, at that time their neighbor in the Schwanenwerder estate. Goebbels was close to leaving with her, but at the last moment Hitler intervened to save his friend's marriage, expelling the Czech mistress from the country, never to be seen again. 3 days after the outbreak of the Second World War, on the 3rd of September 1939, the German submarine U-30 sank the British ocean liner SS Athenia, in which 112 passengers died, including several American citizens. This event was immediately exploited by Goebbels, who fabricated a lie through an article in the newspaper Völkischer Beobachter, claiming that the sinking had in fact been carried out by the British themselves, with the intention of blaming the Third Reich for what had happened and forcing the United States to enter the conflict. Interestingly, this incident, along with others during the war, was just one example of the many fabrications manipulated by the Minister of Propaganda. It was Goebbels' idea to stage the French surrender in 1940 in the very railway carriage in which the Armistice of Compiègne had been signed after Germany's capitulation in the First World War, a humiliation the French were forced to endure, just as the Germans had 20 years earlier. The following year, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Goebbels became famous for broadcasting fanfares and the music of Richard Wagner over the radio with every victory against the Red Army. Regarding the Jews, he vented his greatest fury by justifying their isolation in Polish ghettos through films such as Jude Seuss, The Eternal Jew, Der ewige Jude, and The Rothschilds, Die Rothschilds. Goebbels also arranged for Radio Hamburg to provide a platform for William Joyce, an Englishman from the British Union of Fascists, to broadcast propaganda against England and recruit volunteers for the so-called British Free Corps of the SS. Another peculiar function of the Minister of Propaganda was to act as Hitler's astrologer, investigating horoscopes and the prophecies of the visionary Nostradamus in order to predict victories or defeats on the battlefield. Only 11 days after the Axis defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, on the 13th of February, 1943, Joseph Goebbels declared total war in a speech at Berlin's Sport Palace, through which all of Germany and its citizens were placed in service of the war. From that moment on, Goebbels delivered grand speeches calling for the recruitment of children and the elderly as combatants within the Volkssturm, popularly known as the People's Army. Not even the assassination attempt against Hitler on the 20th of July, 1944, intimidated Goebbels during the coup d'etat, for it was in his own home that he handed the telephone to Otto Remer, commander of the Berlin Reserve Battalion, as Remer was preparing to arrest him after being deceived by the conspirators. Remer immediately realized that it was all a ruse, and thus turned against the traitors, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg. At the beginning of 1945, Hitler appointed Goebbels as defender of Berlin in the face of the ever closer advance of the Red Army from the east and the Allies from the west. Over the radio, Goebbels ordered the Germans to practice scorched earth so that only ashes would remain for the enemy. He also denounced the Geneva Convention, encouraging the defenders of the capital to execute American and British pilots who had parachuted after being shot down. Even during those final days, he did not stop interpreting astrology or supposed miraculous signs, such as the death of the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, after assuring Hitler by telephone that it was a stroke of luck granted by the stars. Coinciding with Hitler's 56th birthday, Goebbels moved into the bunker beneath the Chancellery to share his leader's fate. He brought with him his wife Magda and their 6 children, who took shelter underground to avoid being struck by Soviet bombs and artillery shells. They spent 10 days there, witnessing Hitler's marriage to Eva Braun and the Führer's announcement of his intention to commit suicide. Magda, unable to be restrained by her husband, begged Hitler not to do it, but her pleas were in vain. Finally, on the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the temple, and Eva poisoned herself. Grieved by the death of his friend, Goebbels participated in the incineration of his leader's body in the courtyard of the Chancellery, though the funeral was abruptly interrupted by the fall of artillery shells while he was giving the Nazi salute. One day after Hitler's suicide, on the 1st of May 1945, both Goebbels and Magda decided to share the same fate so as not to fall into Soviet hands. They both agreed to first eliminate their children, when Magda pronounced the following words: "My children are too beautiful to live in a world without National Socialism." It was then that Magda put her 6 little ones to sleep with sleeping pills and afterward poisoned them with cyanide. Thus died Helga, Hilda, Helmuth, Holda, Hedda, and Haida, with only Harold, her son from her previous marriage, surviving, since as a war pilot, he was being held prisoner in Great Britain. Only a few hours later, at 6:15 in the evening, the couple walked up to the courtyard of the Chancellery, arm in arm. First, Goebbels raised his pistol and shot Magda in the heart. Immediately afterward, he swallowed a cyanide capsule and then shot himself in the head. Once the grim ritual was over, the SS guards carried their bodies to a shell crater and incinerated them with gasoline. With the ashes of Joseph Goebbels, the words of the man who until then had been one of the main leaders of the Third Reich dissolved into the air forever. This figure, essential to the historic rise of National Socialism, was considered the greatest propagandist of the 20th century. A man who rose as the master of political propaganda, manipulating the minds and hearts of millions. His ability to control the media and shape public perception was instrumental in consolidating the power of the Nazi regime. From the earliest days of the party's rise to power, this politician demonstrated unparalleled cunning in using radio, cinema, and the printed press. He understood that information could be more powerful than bullets, and under his direction, the German media were transformed into tools of indoctrination and control. One of his first feats was orchestrating the book burning of 1933, a symbolic act aimed at purging German culture of any influence deemed un-German. This event not only physically eliminated literary works, but also sent a clear message about the kind of society the regime intended to build, one where intellectual dissent would have no place. During the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936, he managed to turn the sporting event into a spectacle of propaganda. Under his guidance, the image of a strong, united, and modern Germany was broadcast to the world. The Games became a diplomatic tool, projecting an appearance of normality and international prestige, while hiding the brutalities already being perpetrated within the country. Another of his great political feats was his ability to maintain the morale of the German people during the dark years of the Second World War. As the conflict dragged on and defeats mounted, he used incendiary speeches and promises of final victory to keep the fighting spirit alive. His speeches, filled with nationalist fervor and hatred toward the enemies of the Reich, were fundamental in sustaining the struggle until the very last days of the conflict. In the final moments of the war, when defeat was inevitable, he made one last attempt to maintain the cohesion and resistance of the German people. His capacity to manipulate information and create a narrative of desperate struggle against a ruthless enemy was crucial in prolonging the conflict, albeit at an incalculable human cost. The political feats of this man were a combination of psychological manipulation, control of the media, and a profound understanding of human emotions. Through his tireless efforts, he left an indelible mark on history, demonstrating the immense power of propaganda in the hands of a skilled and unscrupulous operator. As the war approached its tragic end, the master of propaganda did not cease in his effort to maintain the illusion of a possible victory. With Berlin under siege and Allied forces advancing relentlessly, he launched a final campaign of desperate propaganda. Through radio broadcasts and leaflets, he continued to insist that defeat was not an option, that total resistance was the only honorable path. This campaign sought to instill a sense of duty and sacrifice in the German people, urging them to fight to the last man, woman, and child. In April of 1945, with Soviet troops already inside Berlin, his rhetoric reached a climax of desperation. He declared that the city would become a fortress, a scorched land that the enemies would never capture without fierce resistance. In reality, this stance only prolonged the suffering of the civilians trapped in the city, subjected to relentless bombardment and the violence of street battles. Even in these final moments, his ability to manipulate perceptions and motivate Berlin's defenders was remarkable. With each broadcast, he tried to maintain morale by appealing to loyalty to the Führer and love for the homeland. He promised that despite the circumstances, a miraculous victory was within reach if only they remained steadfast. However, reality could not be concealed for long. On the 30th of April of 1945, with the fall of Berlin inevitable, his supreme leader took his own life in the Chancellery bunker. At this point, his world of illusions began to collapse. In one last macabre demonstration of loyalty and desperation, he followed the same fate, accompanied by his family, in an act that symbolized the total destruction that he and his regime had brought upon Germany and the world. His legacy is one of the darkest in human history. The political feats of the master of propaganda not only consolidated a totalitarian regime, but also demonstrated the power of manipulation and misinformation. Through his speeches and his absolute control of the media, he was able to shape the reality perceived by millions, leading them into a devastating war and total destruction. History remembers him not only as a talented propagandist, but as a terrifying example of how rhetoric and manipulation can be used for malevolent purposes. His techniques and approach continue to be studied as a warning about the dangers of information control and propaganda in politics. Ultimately, his story is a grim reminder of how one man, armed with words and media power, could lead an entire nation into catastrophe. The world emerged from the ruins of the most destructive conflict in history. The feats of the Nazi master of propaganda were etched as a haunting reminder of the power of mass manipulation. The Nuremberg trials, which sought justice for the atrocities committed during the Nazi regime, exposed the depths of deception and moral corruption that he had fostered. Although he did not live to face trial, his legacy was dissected and analyzed as an example of the perversity that propaganda can reach. The influence of his tactics did not end with the conclusion of the Second World War. In the following decades, scholars, political scientists, and journalists studied his methods not only to understand the past, but also to identify and prevent future abuses of media power. His methods, though immoral and destructive, demonstrated the effectiveness of propaganda in mobilizing and radicalizing the masses. In an era of growing media and technological influence, his strategies served as a warning about the inherent dangers of information control and manipulation. In the years following the war, the democracies of the world faced the difficult task of building systems that would protect freedom of the press and the diversity of opinions. Censorship and informational manipulation, so effectively used by him, became practices to be avoided at all costs. However, his shadow continued to loom in the dark corners of global politics. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th and 21st centuries, from the Soviet bloc to dictatorships in other parts of the world, adopted and adapted his propaganda techniques. These governments learned from his successes and failures, perfecting the ability to shape public perception and suppress dissent. History repeated itself in cycles of repression and resistance, and each generation had to face the challenge of discerning the truth in a world full of manipulative voices. Over time, the figure of this Nazi propagandist became a symbol of warning. In Holocaust museums, in history books, in courses on ethics and communication, his name and his actions were discussed as a case study of moral limits and the dangers of unchecked power. The memory of his political feats was preserved not only as a condemnation, but as an eternal lesson on the importance of truth, integrity, and vigilance in defending freedom and human dignity. Today, in the digital era, where information spreads instantly and fake news can influence elections and provoke conflicts, the lessons derived from his use of propaganda are more relevant than ever. The need for an informed and critical citizenry, capable of questioning and challenging imposed narratives, is one of the most important lessons his legacy left behind. The fight against informational manipulation continues, and the world still remembers the political feats of the master of propaganda as a dark example of what can happen when truth is distorted in the service of power. For Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels was not merely a minister or a subordinate. He was a devoted disciple and one of the most loyal and strategically essential collaborators of the Nazi regime. At the core of the power of the Third Reich, Goebbels played the role of chief architect of propaganda, uniting the German nation under the somber banners of National Socialism and fueling the cult of personality around the Führer. From the very beginning of their political relationship, Goebbels displayed unwavering loyalty toward Hitler. He saw in him not only a leader, but an almost messianic figure destined to restore Germany's greatness. His ability to translate Hitler's ideas and objectives into powerful and convincing messages allowed the Führer to consolidate his control over the country and mobilize the German people in support of his expansionist and genocidal ambitions. Hitler, recognizing Goebbels' value and skill, granted him a level of trust and access that few enjoyed. Through speeches, films, posters, and radio broadcasts, Goebbels built and maintained the image of the Führer as Germany's savior. He was responsible for framing every action of the regime, every victory, and every sacrifice within a heroic and glorifying narrative. The relationship between the two men was based on mutual understanding and a shared vision. Goebbels admired Hitler deeply, and his devotion was as personal as it was political. In the final days of the Reich, as Berlin fell and the reality of defeat became unavoidable, Goebbels remained loyal until the bitter end. His last demonstration of loyalty was to die at his leader's side, sealing his fate along with that of the man to whom he had dedicated his entire political life. For Hitler, Goebbels was more than a minister of propaganda. He was a fundamental pillar in the construction and maintenance of his power. His ability to manipulate public opinion and his unconditional commitment to the regime's objectives made him an indispensable ally. In the chaos and brutality of war, Goebbels stood out as the most fervent defender of Nazism, a man whose blind faith in Hitler led him to commit and justify the worst atrocities. In the end, the story of Joseph Goebbels is inseparable from that of Adolf Hitler. His legacy is that of a man who, with words and lies, helped shape one of the darkest chapters in human history, showing how loyalty and propaganda can become weapons of mass destruction. For Hitler, he was the most faithful of acolytes, a master of illusion who, until his last breath, believed in his leader's insane dream. In the final days of April, as the Red Army advanced inexorably toward the heart of Berlin, the atmosphere inside the Führer's bunker was grim. Desperation and the collapse of the Third Reich were evident. But amid that chaos, Joseph Goebbels maintained his unshakable loyalty to Adolf Hitler. For Goebbels, this was not merely a moment of crisis. It was the ultimate test of his unwavering devotion. After Hitler's suicide, Goebbels assumed the role of Chancellor of the Reich, though his mandate was brief. Together with his wife Magda, he prepared for the end he had always anticipated, but never publicly spoken of. In a macabre act of loyalty and despair, the Goebbels decided they would not allow their children to grow up in a world without National Socialism. In one of the most tragic and disturbing scenes of the Second World War, Magda Goebbels, with the help of SS Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, administered poison to her children, after which she and Joseph took their own lives. As mentioned before, Goebbels' end was a reflection of his life, dramatic, extremist, and completely devoted to the cause he had embraced since his earliest days in the Nazi Party. His death, along with that of his family, symbolized the total destruction of the world he had helped build and his absolute loyalty to the man he had considered his savior and supreme leader. After the war, the world faced the task of understanding and judging the actions of Goebbels and his colleagues. The Nuremberg trials exposed the propaganda machinery he had created, revealing how he had manipulated an entire nation to follow Hitler into the abyss. Although Goebbels was not present to face justice, his legacy was condemned in history. The lessons derived from his life and his role in the Third Reich served as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the manipulation of information. The figure of Joseph Goebbels remains a dark reminder of how a man armed with words and radical convictions can lead a nation to destruction. Today, his life and work are studied as examples of the extremes to which political propaganda can go. His tactics and strategies are analyzed not only to understand the past, but also to prevent something similar from happening again. The memory of Joseph Goebbels is a grim lesson about the capacity of propaganda to influence, corrupt, and destroy, and about the importance of truth and integrity in the defense of freedom and human dignity.